Last summer, my drone recorded something unbelievable. A hidden settlement of giant creatures deep in the Appalachian Mountains. I never imagined I would be the one to discover something like that. My name is Ethan Carter, and what happened to me last August in the forests of West Virginia changed my life completely. I'm not a scientist or explorer, just a regular drone hobbyist and amateur photographer who enjoys filming rivers, cliffs, and abandoned places for my small travel blog. What was supposed to be a simple trip to capture footage of an old, abandoned fire lookout tower turned into the most disturbing 10 days of my life. During that trip, I witnessed things that shouldn't exist, spent days near creatures people insist are only legends, and barely made it back home with my sanity. I'm telling this story now because people deserve to know what may actually live in those isolated forests where almost no one hikes anymore. Some officials have probably seen signs before, and after what happened to me, I'm convinced the truth is being quietly ignored. I drove up from Charleston on a Tuesday, the kind of late summer day that feels too perfect. Blue sky, cool wind off the ridgeline, the smell of pine so thick you could almost drink it. I had my gear packed tight in the back of my truck. 2 drones, a mirrorless camera, a week's worth of food, and a folding cot I'd been meaning to replace for 3 years. The area I'd chosen was a stretch of national forest about 40 miles from the nearest town with a gas station. I'd found it on a topographic map, a long ridge with a fire lookout tower marked on it, supposedly abandoned since the 80s. No trails, no cell service past a certain point. That was exactly what I wanted. I remember feeling good that morning, genuinely light. Looking back now, I think part of me knew that lightness wouldn't last. I just didn't want to admit it yet.
I set up camp on the eastern slope of the ridge, near a narrow creek that ran cold and clear, even in August. The tower was about 2 miles further up through dense forest, and I planned to fly my primary drone to scout the approach before hiking in. Standard practice for me. You don't walk blind into unfamiliar terrain if you can help it. The drone lifted clean. No wind interference, great battery signal, stable feed on my tablet screen. I remember watching the tree canopy open up on the display as the drone climbed. That familiar patchwork of dark green broken up by granite outcroppings and the occasional silver flash of water below. For the first 20 minutes, everything was exactly what I expected. Then I pushed the drone further west than I'd planned. I'm still not entirely sure why. The ridge curved in a way that caught my eye on the screen, a strange shadowed fold in the terrain that the topo map hadn't shown clearly. I told myself I was just checking sightlines for the next morning's shoot. That was the first decision I made that I can't fully explain. And looking back now, it was the one that started all of this. The clearing appeared on my screen without warning. One moment, there was unbroken canopy, and then a gap, perfectly oval, maybe 200 meters across, sitting in a natural bowl between 2 forested ridges. No road leading to it, no power lines. Nothing that suggested any human activity had ever touched that spot. But the clearing wasn't empty. I brought the drone down to about 60 meters and switched to the zoom camera. The feed pixelated for a second, then sharpened, and I felt something I can only describe as a cold pressure behind my eyes. Like my brain was trying to refuse what it was seeing before I'd even fully processed it. Structures. Large ones, arranged in a rough circle around a central fire pit, the ash still dark and fresh-looking. Not tents, not tarps. Actual constructed shelters, heavy timber frames, bark siding,
roofs layered with what looked like pine boughs and packed earth. They were built low and wide, each one roughly the size of a two-car garage, but shaped differently, organically somehow, like they'd grown from the ground rather than been built on top of it. And the scale of them was wrong. The doorways, if you could call them that, were open archways nearly 3 meters high. I hovered there for a long moment, tablet in both hands, telling myself there was a reasonable explanation. A survival school, maybe. An eccentric off-grid community. Some kind of outdoor theater set that a film crew had abandoned. My mind was working hard to find an exit from what I was looking at. Then, one of the shelters moved. Not the shelter itself, something that had been leaning against it in the shadows. Something I had initially read as a dark pile of timber or bundled furs. It straightened up, slowly. And it kept straightening long past the point where a human being would have run out of height. I want to be careful about how I describe what I saw next, because I've spent months trying to be precise about it, trying to make sure I'm telling you what I actually saw, and not what fear told me I saw afterward. It was large, significantly larger than any person. My drone was at 60 meters altitude, and the figure below still registered as substantial on the feed. I've since done rough calculations based on the shelter dimensions, and my best estimate puts it somewhere between 8 and 9 feet tall. Heavily built, covered in what appeared to be dark reddish-brown hair, though the camera resolution made it hard to be certain at that distance. It moved with weight. That's the only way I know how to say it. Every step it took looked like something that had mass, real enormous mass, shifting through space. Not the loose movement of a costume. Not the careful, self-conscious movement of a person trying to perform something. Just motion. Unself-conscious. Purposeful. It walked to the central fire pit, crouched beside it, and began adding wood from a stack nearby. I didn't move for what felt like a very long time. Then I saw a second one emerge from the tree line, smaller, still enormous, but proportionally slighter, and moving with less gravity. Younger, maybe. It was carrying something across its shoulders that I eventually identified as a large animal carcass. Deer, possibly. Maybe larger. It dropped it near the meat-drying racks I could now see strung between two of the shelters. There was a third one, partially hidden under the overhang of the largest structure, working with its hands at something I couldn't identify. Rhythmic, patient movements, like someone carving or weaving. A community. That's what I was looking at. Not an animal den, not a random sighting. A functioning, organized community of creatures that every rational part of my education told me did not exist. I pulled the drone back slowly, hands shaking badly enough that I nearly dropped the tablet. I got it home. I landed it. And then I sat down on the ground next to my truck and stared at the footage on the screen for a long time without doing anything else. That night in my tent, reviewing the recording by headlamp, I noticed something I had missed in the field. There was a moment, near the end of the flight, maybe 30 seconds before I pulled back, where the creature by the fire stopped what it was doing and looked up. Directly up. Directly at where the drone had been hovering. At the time, I told myself it was coincidence, that it had heard something, that it was just looking at the sky. I told myself a lot of things that first night. I believed almost none of them. And somewhere deep in the part of me that doesn't lie, I already knew I was going to go back. I should have packed up my truck that same night and driven back to Charleston. Any reasonable person would have. I had footage on my tablet, that was either the most important discovery in modern history or proof that I was losing my mind. And either way, the smart move was to put distance between me and that clearing. I knew that. I sat with it for a long time in my tent, listening to the creek and the wind, and I made the wrong choice anyway. I went back the next morning on foot. I told myself I needed confirmation. That drone footage was easy to dismiss, shaky, distant, easy to misread. What I needed were photographs, close ones, the kind that couldn't be explained away by a skeptical comment section. I packed my mirrorless camera, 2 extra lenses, and a small recorder, and I left my truck before sunrise, moving west along the ridge toward the bowl I'd spotted from the air. I remember the forest being unusually quiet that morning. No birds, not even wind moving through the upper canopy. Looking back, I think I registered that as strange even then. I just didn't let myself stop and think about what it meant. It took me almost 3 hours to reach the edge of the clearing on foot. The terrain was rougher than the drone footage had made it look. Steep, root-tangled, with stretches of loose shale that shifted under my boots and made silence impossible. By the time I reached the tree line and could see the settlement through the brush, the sun was already high. The creatures were active, more of them than I'd counted the day before, at least 6 that I could see from my position, moving between the shelters and the central fire with a casual domestic rhythm that I found almost more unsettling than anything else. They weren't hiding. They weren't cautious. This was just their day. I crouched behind a deadfall about 40 meters from the nearest structure and started shooting.
Long lens, silent shutter mode, hands steadier than I expected given how fast my heart was going. I got good frames. I could see faces, broad, heavy-browed, with deep-set eyes that caught the light in a way that looked almost amber. I could see hands working, thick-fingered, dexterous, nothing like the clumsy paws you'd imagine if you'd only ever thought about this from a distance. One of them was doing something with sinew and bone that looked, with horrible clarity, exactly like tool-making. That was when I stepped on the branch. The sound was small, a dry snap, barely louder than a finger pop. But the reaction was instant. Every creature in the clearing stopped. Not startled, stopped. The way a group of people stop when someone says something that changes the room. Heads turned, not toward each other but outward, scanning. And within seconds, 2 of them were moving toward the tree line, toward me. Not running, walking with that same weighted, purposeful stride I'd seen on the drone feed, which was somehow worse than running would have been. I didn't move. I don't know if that was smart or just fear making the decision for me. I pressed myself against the deadfall and held still and watched them come closer through my viewfinder. Closer than I'd ever wanted anything that large to be. And then they were standing at the edge of the trees, less than 10 meters away, and one of them looked directly at me. Not in my direction, at me. There was no confusion in that look, no animal uncertainty. It simply saw me, and it knew I was there, and it waited. The others arrived quietly behind it. I counted 5 surrounding me before I stopped counting, and not one of them made a sound. They took my camera first, then my recorder, then the bag. They handled the equipment with a carefulness that frightened me almost as much as their size, because it meant they understood what it was. One of them turned the camera over in its hands, looked at the lens for a moment, then set it on the ground and pressed it flat with one deliberate motion. The sound it made was very final. I didn't fight. I didn't run. Something about the way they'd positioned themselves told me clearly that neither of those options was really available to me anymore. And then the largest one turned away from me and began walking back into the forest, deeper west, away from my camp.
It didn't look back to see if I was following. It didn't need to. I understood. I picked myself up off the ground, and I followed it into the trees. And with every step I took, I was aware that I had just crossed a line I didn't know how to uncross. They walked faster than I expected. That was the first thing that recalibrated my understanding of what I was dealing with. The sheer, effortless pace of them through terrain that was costing me everything I had. Roots, loose rock, dense undergrowth that grabbed at my boots and jacket. None of it seemed to register for them. They moved through the forest the way water moves through a landscape, finding the path of least resistance without appearing to look for it. I was breathing hard within 20 minutes. They weren't breathing hard at all. I tried to track our direction, west mostly, then curving southwest along a drainage I hadn't seen on any map. The forest got older as we moved deeper. Bigger trees, further apart, the undergrowth thinning out into something that felt almost cathedral-like in its quiet. No birds here either. I remember thinking that the absence of birdsong was starting to feel less like coincidence and more like information. Something about this part of the forest had been empty for a long time. I just didn't know yet what that meant. After what I estimated was 2 hours of walking, the terrain dropped sharply.
A canyon, narrow, maybe 30 meters across at its widest, with walls of dark, layered stone that rose steeply on both sides. I hadn't known it was there. It wasn't on the topo maps I'd studied. The creature leading me stopped at the rim for a moment, and I had the brief, irrational hope that we'd reached some kind of boundary, and it would simply leave me here. Then it stepped over the edge onto a path cut into the rock face, barely a path, more a series of deliberate footholds, and descended. I followed because there was nothing else to do. The canyon floor was cool and shadowed, even at midday. A thin creek ran along the center of it, and the smell was different down there. Damp stone, pine resin, something older underneath that I couldn't identify and didn't want to think about too hard. The walls on both sides were marked. I noticed that almost immediately, even in my state. Symbols carved into the rock at varying heights, some of them clearly old, weathered deep into the stone, and others fresher, the edges still sharp. Geometric shapes, mostly, repeated patterns, lines that connected into forms that almost resolved into something recognizable before they didn't. I told myself I'd try to memorize them. I wasn't sure why. Some part of me was still operating like a documentarian even then, still trying to record and preserve, even with nothing left to record with. The tunnels opened in the northern wall of the canyon. Not caves exactly. The entrances were too regular, too deliberate. Framed with heavy timber and flat stone in a way that made them look almost architectural. There were 4 of them that I could see, at different heights in the rock face, connected by ledges and what appeared to be rope structures, thick braided rope, anchored to iron-dark spikes driven into the stone. The largest tunnel entrance was at ground level, tall enough that the biggest creature walked through it without ducking. I had to remind myself to keep moving when I saw it. Something about the darkness inside that opening felt absolute in a way that ordinary darkness doesn't. Inside was not what I expected. I think I had braced myself for something animal, a den, a cave, raw and dark and foul-smelling. What I found instead was a living space. Low fires burned in carved stone basins along the walls, casting warm, unsteady light across a space that was high-ceilinged and dry. The floor was packed earth, covered in places with heavy, layered hides.
There were objects everywhere, tools, containers, stacked materials I couldn't identify, arranged with an organizational logic I could almost, but not quite, follow. It smelled like wood smoke and dried meat, and something herbal, sharp and faintly sweet. It smelled like somewhere people lived. There were more of them inside. I counted at least a dozen before I gave up counting. Some looked up when I entered. Most didn't. A few of the younger ones moved closer, not aggressively, just with the frank curiosity of children who haven't learned yet to pretend they aren't staring. One of them reached out and touched my jacket sleeve, then pulled its hand back and looked at its fingers as if checking for a residue. I stood very still and let it happen. I had already understood, somewhere in the walk down through that canyon, that my safety depended entirely on not being a threat. Whatever they decided I was, I needed to be something they could tolerate, something they could keep. It was the elderly one that approached me last. Larger than the others, but slower, with a heaviness that read less like size and more like age. The hair across its shoulders was lighter, almost gray at the tips, and its eyes, when they settled on me, had a quality I can only describe as deliberate. It looked at me the way you look at something you've been expecting, something you've thought about before it arrived. That look unsettled me more than anything else that had happened since morning, though I didn't fully understand why until later. I should have understood it right then. Looking back now, the answer was already there in that first long look. I just wasn't ready to see it yet. The first day inside the canyon, I told myself, was the hardest. I was wrong about that, but at the time it felt true. They gave me a space near one of the stone fire basins, a low sleeping area lined with folded hides that were surprisingly clean and dry. And for most of that first day, they simply left me alone. Food appeared without ceremony. Dried meat, something that tasted like a root vegetable cooked soft, water in a wide stone bowl. I ate because I knew I needed to. I didn't taste any of it. My mind was still running calculations I couldn't finish: distance from camp, direction of travel, whether anyone would look for me, and where they would look, and how long I had before looking stopped. What I hadn't accounted for was how quickly isolation resets your sense of normal. By the second morning, I had started to observe rather than just endure. It was the only way I knew how to cope. Turn it into documentation, even without any tools to document with. I watched the way the space organized itself through the day. The younger ones moved freely, noisy in a low, rumbling way, occasionally disciplined with a sound from one of the adults that worked like a word, even though I couldn't parse it as one. Work happened in shifts of a kind, some sleeping while others were active, a rotation that didn't map cleanly onto any schedule I could identify, but clearly had its own internal logic. There was hierarchy, but it expressed itself quietly. No displays, no obvious dominance behavior. Just a subtle gravitational pull toward certain individuals whose decisions became the shape of the day. The elderly one was at the center of all of it. I had started thinking of it privately as the elder, for lack of anything better. It moved through the space differently than the others. Slower, yes, but also with a kind of intentionality that made everything it did feel considered. It watched me often. Not constantly, not intrusively, but regularly, the way you check on something you're responsible for. That quality of attention should have reassured me. It didn't. There was something underneath the watchfulness that I couldn't name, and unnamed things in that situation had a way of feeling dangerous by default. The symbols started on the third day. The elder came to the wall nearest my sleeping area in the early morning, before the fire basins had been stoked back to full warmth, and began marking the stone with a piece of dark pigment, charcoal, I thought, or something like it. The marks were deliberate and slow, each one placed with the care of someone writing rather than drawing. Some of the shapes matched what I'd seen carved into the canyon walls outside. Others were new, or new to me. I sat and watched and didn't speak. Speaking felt wrong in a way I couldn't have explained, like talking during something that required silence. When it finished, the elder turned and looked at me for a long moment, then touched the center mark with 2 fingers and turned back to the rest of the space. I memorized that symbol. I still see it sometimes when I close my eyes in the dark. The ceremonies began on the 4th night. I want to be careful here because I know how this part sounds. I know the words available to me, ritual, ceremony, sacrifice, carry weight that distorts what I'm trying to describe. What I saw was not theatrical. It was not dramatic in any conventional sense. It was quiet in a way that somehow made it heavier. The elder would sit at the center of the main chamber as the fires burned lower, and the others would arrange themselves in a loose circle. And there would be a period of sound, low, resonant, more felt than heard, that seemed to come from all of them at once, without any of them appearing to lead it. Then the elder would move to the wall and add marks. Then it would approach me. Each night it did something slightly different. The first night it simply stood close and observed. The second night it placed its hand flat on the wall beside my head and held it there for a long moment before withdrawing. The third night it marked my forearm with the same pigment it used on the walls, a single symbol, applied carefully, almost gently. I didn't pull away. I understood by then that resistance would cost me more than compliance. But what I couldn't shake, lying awake afterward in the ember light, with that mark drying on my skin, was the feeling that each night was a step in a sequence, that something was being built toward, that I was not a guest in these ceremonies, I was the subject of them. I started paying attention to patterns in a different way after that, not just observing the community, but trying to read the direction of things. How the others looked at me had shifted subtly over the days. Less curiosity, more of something I could only read as expectation. The younger ones had stopped approaching me. The elder spent more time near my sleeping area, marking new symbols on the surrounding walls, expanding whatever record or map or message it was constructing. The circle during the nightly ceremonies drew slightly tighter each time. None of these things were alarming on their own, but I had spent enough of my life reading rooms to know when a room is moving toward something. And this room was moving. I just didn't yet know toward what. That changed on the 5th night. And once I understood what I was looking at, I knew I couldn't wait any longer. The 5th night started the same way the others had. Fires burning low, the circle forming, that deep, resonant sound filling the chamber like something physical pressing against the walls. I had learned by then to sit still through it. Not calm, never calm, but still. Stillness was the only currency I had left in that place, and I spent it carefully. But something was different that night from the first moment, and I knew it the way you know a change in weather before you can see it. The air in the chamber felt closer. The circle was tighter than it had ever been, and the elder, when it took its place at the center, did not look at the walls first. It looked at me. It held something I hadn't seen before, a bundle of some kind, bound with sinew, about the length of my forearm, that it set on the ground between us with a deliberateness that made the simple act feel like a statement. I didn't know what was inside it. I still don't, not for certain, but the way the others shifted when it was placed down, a subtle, collective settling, like an audience when the lights go dark, told me that whatever it was, they all knew its significance. I was the only one in that room who didn't. And that asymmetry, which had been true since the first morning, suddenly felt much less tolerable than it had before. The marking that night was different too. The elder didn't go to the wall first. It came to me directly, pigment already on its fingers, and began adding to the symbol on my forearm, extending it, connecting it to new shapes, building outward from that first mark in a way that felt like it was completing something rather than beginning it. I watched it work and kept my breathing even and tried to think clearly, which was almost impossible. But underneath the fear, there was something else working. Some cold, functional part of my brain that had decided to be useful. And what that part was telling me, assembling the pattern from 5 nights of observation, was this. The sequence was almost finished. Whatever the ceremonies had been building toward, I was close to the end of it. One more night, maybe 2. And I did not want to be present for what came after the last mark was made. I thought about it for a long time after the others slept. Lying on the hides, with the ember light shifting on the ceiling, my marked arm across my chest, running through everything I'd observed about the tunnel system. There were 4 entrances in the canyon wall. The main one I'd come through was always occupied, someone sleeping near it or moving past it at any hour I'd checked. The second one, higher up the rock face and connected by rope ladder, led somewhere I hadn't been able to see clearly. The third appeared to be a storage space, narrow and low. But the fourth, the smallest one, set back in a shadowed recess to the left of the main chamber. I had noticed something about it on the 3rd day that I'd filed away without fully processing at the time. There was a draft coming from it. Faint but consistent. Moving air means an exit, and an exit that no one was watching was the only thing I had. I spent the next day acting as normal as I knew how. Ate what they brought me. Sat where I usually sat. Watched the elder add more marks to the wall with the particular quality of attention I'd learned to perform. Present but unthreatening. Curious but passive. Every hour I was mapping the chamber in my head, timing the rotations, noting who slept where and when. There was one window, a period in the very early morning, a few hours before the fires were re-stoked, when the chamber reached its quietest point and the main entrance had only one occupant, sleeping on its side facing away. That was my window. It was small, and it was uncertain, and it was the only one I had, so I decided to take it. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay still for hours and listened to the chamber settle into its deep quiet, and I waited. The storm arrived sometime after midnight. I heard it first as a change in the draft from the small tunnel, the air pressure shifting, and then as a low resonance in the canyon walls that built slowly into something unmistakable. Rain, heavy and close, drumming on the rock above. Thunder moving through the stone like a second heartbeat. I remember being grateful for it in a way I've never been grateful for weather before or since. Noise was the one thing I needed, and the sky was providing it without being asked. I moved when the thunder was loudest. Slow at first, off the hides without sound, across the chamber floor in the ember dark, with my boots in my hands, and every nerve I had focused on the breathing of the figure near the main entrance. It didn't change. I reached the shadowed recess and found the small tunnel entrance by feel. Low, rough-edged, the draft hitting my face like a signal. I went in on my hands and knees, and I didn't look back. The tunnel was narrow enough that my shoulders brushed both walls, and long enough that the chamber light disappeared completely within the first few meters, leaving me in absolute darkness with nothing to navigate by except the movement of air on my face and the sound of the storm getting slowly, incrementally louder somewhere ahead. I have never wanted anything in my life the way I wanted that sound to keep getting louder. And then, at some point I can't precisely locate because time had stopped working normally, I felt the tunnel floor slope upward, and the air changed, and my reaching hand found open space instead of rock, and I understood I was out. I didn't know yet what was behind me. I didn't know if they'd noticed. But somewhere back in that tunnel, in the dark, I thought I heard something begin to move, and that was enough. The rain hit me the moment I cleared the tunnel mouth. Cold, heavy, the kind of rain that soaks through everything in seconds and turns forest floor into something that shifts under your feet. I was on a narrow ledge, maybe 4 meters above the canyon floor, the rock face wet and black behind me, the storm reducing visibility to almost nothing. I stood there for exactly 1 second, long enough to get my bearings and my boots on, and then I moved. I went up. The canyon rim was above me, and the canyon floor was where they would look first, so up was the only direction that made sense. The ledge connected to a series of natural steps in the rock, slick with rain, and I climbed them fast, with my hands and feet both working, not thinking about falling, because thinking about falling would have made me fall. The thunder was continuous now, one long, rolling conversation between clouds, and I used every loud moment to move faster and every quiet interval to listen behind me. For the first few minutes, I heard nothing except rain and my own breathing. Then, somewhere below and to my left, I heard something that was not rain and not thunder. A sound like movement through underbrush, heavy, purposeful, fast. They were out of the tunnels. They were already in the canyon. I cleared the rim and hit the forest running. I want to be honest about those next 20 minutes because I think dishonesty would be easy here, and I've committed to not taking the easy version of this story. The truth is, I was not fast. I was exhausted and soaked and operating on no sleep, and the forest in that storm was as close to total darkness as anything I've ever moved through. I fell twice in the first 100 meters. The second fall put my hand into something sharp, a rock or a broken branch, and I ran the rest of the way with my palm bleeding into the wet moss and dead leaves, and I didn't stop to look at it. Stopping was not something I was able to consider. What I had going for me was direction. I had spent 5 days in that canyon, memorizing what I could see of the sky through the tunnel entrances and the canyon rim, triangulating east from the position of the light. I knew my camp was northeast of the canyon. Not how far, that I couldn't know, but the direction was fixed in me like a compass bearing, and I held on to it the way you hold on to the one thing you're sure of when everything else is uncertain. I ran northeast through the dark and the rain, and I did not let myself think about what was behind me. Thinking about it would have slowed me down, and slowing down was not survivable. At some point, I genuinely cannot tell you how long after I cleared the rim, I became aware that the sounds behind me had stopped. Not gradually, not fading with distance, just gone. One moment there was something moving in the forest behind me, and then there wasn't. I didn't stop running. I've thought about that absence a lot since then. Why they stopped, where they went, whether it was a decision or a boundary, or something else entirely. I don't have an answer. What I know is that the forest went quiet behind me, and the storm kept going, and I kept running, until my legs stopped working properly, and then I walked until they did again. I found the creek before I found the camp. The same narrow creek I'd set up beside 4 days earlier, running fast and loud with the storm's extra water. I followed it downstream and walked out of the trees into the small clearing where my truck was parked, still there, exactly where I'd left it, with the dome light of my tablet glowing faintly through the rear window where I'd forgotten to turn it off. I stood at the edge of the clearing for a long moment, looking at it. Normal things had started to look strange to me by then. Too rectangular, too deliberate, too manufactured. My own truck looked like something from a different world, which, in a way, it was. I drove out without breaking camp.
Left the tent, the cot, the spare drone, all of it. I didn't want to spend another minute in that forest in the dark, doing anything except leaving. I hit the first cell signal about 30 miles east and pulled over on the shoulder of the highway and sat with the heater running and my bleeding hand wrapped in a gas station napkin from the glove box, and I tried to figure out what I was going to tell people. I'm still figuring that out. Every version I've tried sounds wrong in some specific way that I can't fix, because the experience itself doesn't translate cleanly into words that were built for a world where what I saw doesn't exist. I have no footage, no photographs, no physical evidence of any kind except a faded symbol on my forearm that could be anything. A tattoo, a scar, a mark I made myself in some kind of stress response. That's what the one person I told in the first week suggested. I haven't told many people since. But I've thought about it every day. I've looked at maps of that area and found nothing. I've searched for records of similar sightings in those forests and found fragments, old ones mostly, from sources that get dismissed before anyone looks too closely. I think about the elder and the marks on the wall and the bundle set between us on the 5th night. And I think about what the ceremony was building toward. And I think about the fact that I don't know what would have happened if I'd stayed one more day. I'm glad I don't know. I think not knowing is the version of this I can live with. What I can't live with is saying nothing. So I said something. This is it. If any part of what I've described sounds familiar, if you've been in those forests, if you've seen things you couldn't explain, if you felt that particular quality of being watched by something that understood exactly what it was doing, I want to hear from you. Leave it in the comments. I read everything, even when I don't respond. Especially the ones that sound like they were written by someone who needed a long time to decide whether to say it at all. Those are the ones I believe. And if this is the first time you've heard my name, I'm Ethan Carter, and I've been putting out stories like this one for a while now. The real ones, the ones that don't wrap up clean. If that's something you want more of, subscribe. It costs you nothing, and it means I can keep doing this. Because there are other things I haven't talked about yet. Other places. Other trips that didn't go the way I planned. And some of them are worse than this one. I'll see you in the next one. Stay careful out there.